Oh hey, Mr. Morris here. Today we're going to be talking about AQA's GCSE Language Paper 2, Writers, Viewpoints and Perspectives. This is going to be a short video where we go over the layout, structure and strategy for the non-fiction paper from AQA. We should start by discussing what non-fiction means. If fiction means made up or untrue, then non-fiction is the opposite. Non-fiction is based in truth, in the real world, and what's written is a direct experience that the writer has witnessed or lived through or heard about, whereas fiction texts are designed to entertain or describe. Non-fiction texts can have more diverse purposes. People think that most non-fiction is aimed at informing, but it could also be about persuading or arguing. And you always have to think about how the writer wants to present themselves if they feature in their non-fiction writing. The first thing to note is that there are two sources to read. One of them will always be contemporary, from now, the 21st century. One of them will always be from the 19th century, the 1800s. Both sources will share a theme or topic, and that topic is usually something that AQA expect you to know either a little bit about or have an opinion about. In the past, they've chosen things like schools, animal welfare, surfing, cycling, mountaineering, and exploring. These two sources can be any of the non-fiction genre. In the past, there have been letters, diary entries, newspaper articles, extracts from non-fiction books, blog posts. As long as the source is based in fact and isn't fiction or made up, then you could get it as part of your Paper 2 texts. The key skills in this exam are reading and comprehension, understanding, comparison, language analysis, and creative non-fiction writing. I'm going to talk through question by question what is asked of you and what you need to do to ensure you get the maximum number of marks you can. Starting with question 1. Question 1 is worth 4 marks and it's a true or false question. You are given 8 options and each of these options is a statement about one short section of the text. Your job is to work out which 4 are true and which 4 are false. You are asked to shade in the circle inside the box of the 4 that you think are true. And it's as simple as that. The way to ensure you get this mark is by reading all of the statements through before you shade any of them in. A key mistake people make here is shading the first 4 they think are true without reading the rest. And sometimes it's easier to work out which statements are false than which are true, but you might not know that until you read them all. Question 2 is worth 8 marks. And I've heard this question called different things. Some people call it the comparative summary question. Others call it the comparison of topic or comparison of subject. The thing in common with all 3 of those titles is that this question involves comparison. I told you before that the 2 texts are linked thematically. You are going to be asked to compare something from within the 2 texts. For example, if both texts are about mountains, you may get asked to compare the 2 mountains. If both texts are about different sports, you might get asked to compare the sports. You might not be given that word, compare. You might be asked to look for similarities and differences, but that's the same thing. The way people lose marks in this question is by trying to do too much. All you have to do is compare the thing that you are asked to compare. You do not need to analyse language, and there are no marks for it. There are only 3 things that gain you marks in this question. The first is inference, the second is referencing the text or quotes, and the third is comparison. That word inference is key. It's not enough to just repeat what it says in the text. You need to use your skills of inference to work something out about what it says in the text, because that's what inference means. Reading between the lines, using the text as evidence or clues to work something out that is not said. So for example, let's say that one of our texts talks about people losing their lives on a mountain. You can infer that the mountain is dangerous. It doesn't necessarily say that, but it does talk about people dying. So you've used your powers of inference to work out that it's dangerous. Once you've got some inferences from both texts, you're ready to compare. Now I'm going to go on about comparison. It's a passion of mine, and it hurts me to read Year 11 answers every year where the only way that they compare is by using the word however. For example, this is a classic answer. The mountain in text A is dangerous, however, the mountain in text B is not. Frankly, it's not good enough. There are so many brilliant ways to compare, and if you're limiting yourself to however or whereas or on the other hand, then you're not doing yourself justice. You need to make use of comparative adverbs. For example, more, less, far, much, fewer, and comparative adjectives, which is a normal adjective with ER on the end, bigger, smaller. Take, for example, the mountain in source A is much more dangerous than the mountain in text B. One thing not to forget is when you have your comparison, you need to back up your point with evidence. Where in the text have you taken your inference from? I like to use the structure inference, evidence, comparison, inference, evidence. And I like to repeat that twice. That way, you've got 4 quotes, 4 inferences, and 2 points of comparison. I'm going to say it again. All you have to do for this question is to compare the exact thing that the question asks you to compare. If it's mountains, it's mountains. If it's horses, it's horses. Whatever it asks you to compare just that. You do not need to analyze language. There is no need to look for similes, metaphors, personification. No need to look at choice of words and connotations. People get this question confused with question 4, but more on that later. Question 3 is a language analysis question and it's worth 12 marks. You're only going to be asked about one of the 2 sources, and it's very similar to question 2 from language paper 1. The only difference is that it's a non-fiction text instead of a fiction text, so there are some subtleties that you might need to think of, such as persuasion. But the exam boards usually give you a descriptive section of the text where something is described using imagery and detail, so you should still be able to look for the usual things like similes, metaphors, semantic fields, personification, symbolism, and choices of words and their connotations. Because language analysis is one of the skills we practice most in English, I'm not going to spend too long on this question. I recommend using the ECI structure: effect, choice, intention. Firstly, discuss the effect on the reader. The reader gets the impression that, then look at the choice the writer made. For example, the writer chose to include in that section, you need some subject terminology and you need a reference or quote. Finally, the intention. Perhaps the writer was trying to. In this question, you get marks for discussing the effect of the writer's choices, providing a range of references or quotations from the text, and your use of subject terminology. Question 4 is the comparison of perspectives question, or comparison of viewpoints. If you turn this video off now, you might think that this is the same as question 2, but there are some key differences. Rather than just comparing the 2 things that the sources are about, or 2 of the things from the sources, this time you are comparing the writer's opinions on the topic of the question. This question involves both language analysis and comparison. It's not enough to just identify how the writers feel or what the writers think or their opinions. You also need to identify how the writers show their opinions, what choices the writers made to demonstrate their feelings, and how those choices affected us as readers. I like to use the structure ECIC: effect, choice, intention, comparison. Let's say, for example, that the writer of text A hates dolphins. We're going to use the E, the effect, to identify the writer's opinion. We're going to say something like, the reader gets the impression that the writer of text A hates dolphins. Then we're going to explain how we know that. This is the choice section. So we're going to say, for example, the writer chose to use the simile, listening to dolphins feels like stepping on Lego bricks. Once we've got our subject terminology and our quote, we can then talk about intentions. Perhaps the writer was trying to show the negative side to dolphins and convince the reader that there are things to dislike about dolphins as well as the things that people like. Once we've done that, we need to compare. Now, remember what I said about comparison before. We can't just use however or whereas. We've got to use adverbs of comparison. Another thing that will really help our comparison is evaluation, and using adverbs to evaluate is another way to really boost your marks in this question by impressing the examiner. What I mean by this, instead of just writing however source B, we want to say this is completely different to source B, which is much more positive about dolphins. In there, we've got the evaluative adverb completely and the comparative adverb much more. Using these adverbs makes it impossible for your examiner to miss the comparison, and it guides your writing because what you've said in that comparison is going to set you up for what you say in your next ECI. You're marked on 4 things for this question. 1, being able to interpret the writer's perspectives. 2, your understanding of the writer's methods and their effects. 3, a range of references to the text, which is quotes. And 4, your ability to compare. Before we move on to question 5, I want to talk about questions 2, 3, and 4 as a group. The mark scheme is split into levels, with level 1 being simple and limited, level 2 being some understanding, level 3 being clear, relevant understanding and comparison, and level 4 being perceptive and detailed. understanding and comparison. Use your knowledge of these levels to self-assess your work. Ask yourself, where does my writing fit? Is this simple and limited, or does this demonstrate some understanding? Is this clear and relevant, or is this perceptive and detailed? Question 5 is the non-fiction writing question. It's worth 40 marks, and just like on paper 1, it is split into AO5 and AO6. AO5 is your content and organisation, what you write, the validity of your ideas, the structure that you write it in, and its coherence and flow. AO6 is your technical accuracy, your spelling, punctuation, grammar, your ability to write in standard English, to not use slang. Both AO5 and AO6 assess your ability to use higher level vocabulary. Can you use words that are exact and challenging? I've got a whole video on paper 2 question 5 that you can watch that goes into this in lots of detail. So I'm just going to cover the basics. Usually you'll get asked to write one of 3 types of text: a letter, a speech, or an article. Now for this year, 2022, we know that we will definitely get asked to write a newspaper article. That's an advantage because one of the things you get marked for in AO5 is your ability to write in the correct form. You can go away and revise how to write a newspaper article. You need a headline. Your headline will usually state your opinion clearly. Sometimes headlines will involve a question or a joke to engage the audience. You may want to include a subheading which goes into more detail about the topic. I want to make it clear that it's important to write in the style of a newspaper article, but you don't get marks for making your work look like a newspaper article. If you spend time drawing pictures or colouring in a banner, you won't gain any marks. Next, once you've worked out what type of text you need to be writing, you'll need to work out the purpose of the text. You're going to get asked to inform, persuade, or argue, with persuade and argue being much more common. Persuade and argue are both about trying to get the person who's reading it to think the same as you. There are lots of different ways you can do this. You might have learned pirate mouse or deforest or any other group of persuasive techniques. But things like statistics, rhetorical questions, emotive language, their entire purpose is to try and get the person who's reading your work onto your side. Usually the most effective way of persuading somebody is making that person feel that helping you is also helping them. Get inside their head and make them realize that the only thing they need to do is what you want them to do. That's why giving orders, swearing, and shouting might not be the most effective way. Being subtle, praising them, using second person and first person plural pronouns to talk directly to them and include them in your plans will help you get your own way. You are given a statement. This statement will be about a topic that the exam board expect you to know a little bit about and be able to form an opinion about. The statement will say something like, people will happily take public transport to lower their carbon footprint. We'll also go on foreign holidays that require jet travel. We need to give up more to save the environment. Write an article arguing your opinion for or against this statement. And that's all the guidance you get. My top tip, and I'm going to say this clearly, don't say the statement. You should never start with, I agree with this statement. You can take the words from the statement and you can say, I completely agree that we need to do more, but you should never say the statement because newspaper articles or speeches or letters rarely include the words the statement. You could write the statement out and pretend somebody else had said it. You could say, I overheard on the bus today that we should do more, for example. There are lots of things that you need to think about whilst writing this question. You need to think about the structure that you present your argument. You're going to need to have more than one point, and it might be worth your time thinking about the opposite side of the argument, not to persuade both sides, but to put that argument out so you can say why to not agree with it. The key thing is to take your time and be clear. The clarity of your argument is important. I need to know what you actually think, what you want me to think, and why I should think it. It's essential that you plan your work because if you run out of time, there are lots of marks to lose. 24 marks for AO5 and 16 marks for AO6 can be thrown away if you run out of time. It's roughly 1 mark per minute, but you must bear in mind that there are 2 sources to read at the start instead of 1. So it's essential that as you read, you use a highlighter or a pen to annotate your texts and find the things that you might want to talk about later and any words that you might want to steal to use in your own writing. I hope this has been helpful and thank you so much for listening. Please check out my other videos. For example, paper 2 question 5 will be really helpful for this assessment. The best way to get better at this paper is practice. There are past papers available online, but you can create your own paper 2 question 5s, and underneath this video I've put an example of 10 different topics that you could argue about as practice. All you need to do is treat each of those topics like a statement and argue your opinion for or against. Make sure you time yourself because you need to train under pressure so you feel less pressure on the day. Thanks for watching. See you soon.